Accepting credit card payments over the internet seems daunting and difficult, but in this video, I'm going to show you how you can easily integrate Stripe into any application very similar to what you're seeing right now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now in this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about setting up Stripe in your application so you can start accepting payments. I'm going to show you multiple different ways to do it so you can pick the way that's best for you. And like I showed you in the beginning of this video, this is the demo that I kind of used to show off this Stripe example. This is actually from my JavaScript Simplified course. If you're interested in it, I'll link it down below. But essentially all we do is we just add some items to our cart. As you can see, we can have different quantities of items. And when we're ready, we just click this checkout button. And this checkout button essentially behind the scenes is contacting a server that we control, telling Stripe all the things we want to buy, and then it's redirecting us to the Stripe checkout. So when we click checkout, you can see it redirects us to this page, which has all the things that we want to buy, and then we can enter our information, click pay, and it's going to bring us back to the page, or we can click back here, cancel, to go back to the shopping cart where we can change different things. So this is what I'm going to be implementing in this video, but instead of using this example, which is a little bit complex, we're actually going to be stripping things back to just a single checkout button because that's really all you care about when you're implementing payments is you have a checkout button that you want to make a request with. So here we just have a simple checkout button on a page, and in our script.js, if we click this, you can see it logs checkout to the screen. So in order to set up Stripe, the very first thing we need to do is create a server because you need a server to process all the payment stuff since that needs to be secure. It can't happen on the client. So if you don't already have an Express server, you're going to need to follow this step by step. First thing you're going to want to do is just create a folder called server. That's going to be the easiest way to do this. So we'll just create a folder called server, and then we're just going to cd into that server folder here. So we are accessing this folder, and then we need to initialize a new project. So we can say npm init-y. That's going to set us up a package JSON. And then from there, we need to install Express so that we can actually use Express. We're also going to need the Stripe library to integrate with Stripe, and we're going to need a library called .env, which is going to load all of our environment variables for us so that we can use our environment variables such as our Stripe API key inside of our project. Then I want to install one extra dependency. This is going to be a dev dependency. It's called nodemon that just automatically restarts our server for us, which is really handy when you're doing development. Now, if you look inside of our server folder here, we can just create a new file called server.js where we can set up the bare bones of our Express server. Now inside of this file, we just want to set up our Express server. And the very first thing I want to do is actually set up .env. This is going to load our environment variables. So we just require .env, call the config method. That's going to load all of our environment variables, which we're going to set up in a little bit. Then we can set up Express. We can just require Express here. And we can get our app from Express by just saying app is equal to running that Express function. And then what we need to do is, since we're going to be calling this as like an API, we're going to be sending information over JSON. We need to just say app.use. We need to tell it to use express.json, just so we can read all the JSON data that gets sent up to our server. Then the next thing we want to do is set up Stripe. So we can just say Stripe here is going to be equal to requiring the Stripe library that we just downloaded. And this is just a function, and we're going to pass it in our Stripe key. So we can just say process.env.stripe private key. And you can call this final part whatever you want. It's just going to be the private key that's coming from our env variable, which .env is going to set up for us. Then finally, what we need to do is just make our application work. So we'll say app.listen, and we'll just listen on port 3000. And then also we're going to need to set up our store items. So we'll just say our store items is going to be equal to a new map. This is going to be a map that contains our different store items. And if you're unfamiliar with maps in JavaScript, I'll have a video linked in the cards for you to understand them. But essentially, it's just going to be a key value pair of different things, kind of like an object. So for ID1, we're going to have an item, which is just going to have a price, which is going to be 10,000, which is essentially $100. And then we're going to give it a name, and let's just say Learn React Today course. We'll just call it Learn React Today. And then we're going to have another item inside of here. So let's just put another object, which is going to be an ID of 2. And it's going to have a price in cents, which is going to be $200, so 20,000 pennies. And then it's going to have a name, which is going to be Learn CSS Today. And then finally, we're just going to close this off just like that. So now we have this store items map, and the store items map just contains each of our different items that we sell in our store. This is important that you keep all of the information for your items, such as the pricing of those items and their name, on the server in some location. Generally, this is going to be like a database or JSON file. That way, all you do is send the ID from the client to the server. You say, I want to buy item 1, and I want to buy item 2, and I want to buy 2 copies of item 2. You don't actually send the price from the client, because if you do, Anybody could just send a $0 price from the client. They could hack into your code, send a $0 price, and get everything for free. So you need to make sure all this information is stored on your server securely. Also, I did just notice one typo. This should say use instead of request. And that right there is essentially all of the base boilerplate setup for your application that you need to get done. Now, the next thing that I want to do is essentially make sure that we can start this server. So inside of our package JSON, we're just going to create a simple script here. We're just going to call it dev start. And it's just going to call nodemon for server.js. This is going to allow us to start up our application. And if we just run npm run dev start, you can now see down here at the very bottom, it's saying the application started up. It said there's a failure, app.use is not a function. So if we just go back into our server, make sure that we call this express as a function, not just using its name. And now if we scroll down, you can see that we have a bunch of green down here essentially saying that everything is working as expected. So we now have a server running on port 3000 that we can access. And like I said, there's multiple ways you can integrate Stripe. The first way you can integrate Stripe is by having all of your client code and your server code at the same URL. So they're running from the same server. And then the other way you can access it is if your client and your server are completely separate from one another. So I'm going to show you both ways, starting with what happens when the server and the client share the same URL. So inside of our server, we're just going to create a new folder here. We're going to call this folder public. And we're going to move all of our files for our client into that public folder. And then what we want to do inside of our server is we just want to say app.use, and we're going to say express static, and we want to say that it's going to be in the folder public. All this is essentially saying is that all of our client-side code is going to be living inside of this public folder. So now what we can do is we can go to localhost 3000, and we want to go to /, and then if we hit enter, you can see that we now have access to our checkout, and we can click this checkout button and it's logging checkout down here. So this is working exactly as we want. Essentially, all of our public code is living in this public folder and we can access it just like we could before, but now it's living on the same URL as our server. Now, the next thing to do is actually integrate our client and our server. So inside this script.js, this is what's running when we click on this button. And what we want to do is we want to make a request to our server, asking the server to get us a URL to a checkout page. That's the way that Stripe works, is that we give it the information we want. So we're going to give it the IDs of all the products and the number we want to buy. We send that to our server, it's going to get the pricing information from our server, and it's going to use all of that information to give us a unique URL we can use to redirect our user for them to check out and actually pay us money. So we want to make a fetch request to our server. We're going to make it to an endpoint we're going to just call create checkout session. And this create checkout session is something we haven't created yet, but this is going to give us back a URL to where the user can actually access our page. And then we want to make sure the method here is going to be post, because this is going to be a post request. We're going to make sure that our headers is going to be set with a content type. We'll just say content type, and we're going to set that to application JSON because we're sending JSON information. And then on our body, let's actually send that JSON. So we'll say JSON.stringify, and we want to essentially send it an object. This object is going to have an items property. This is going to be an array of all the items we want to send up. So the first one is going to have an ID of 1, and we'll say that it's going to have a quantity of 2. And then we're going to buy second one, which has an ID of 2, and we'll give it a quantity of 1. And let's give this one a quantity of 3. So we're buying 3 copies of item 1 and 1 copy of item 2, and we're sending that up to our server. And then what we want to do is just put a single dot then here. We're going to get our response. We can check if our response is a good response. So if it was successful, then we want to convert this to JSON. So we'll just say return res.json. And then we can just put another dot then down here. And this is going to be our JSON response, which like I said, is going to return to us a URL. We're going to make it so it just returns a URL. And then we're going to use that URL to just set our window.location to that URL. So all this code right here does is it's going to get the response back from our server, which is a URL, and it's going to send the user to that URL. That's what window.location does. Otherwise up here, if our response is not okay, then instead I want to do a different return. I want to do res.json. I want to say .then, and all I want to do is just take the information that's getting returned, which in our case is just JSON, and I want to send that to a promise.reject with that JSON. So all this is doing right here is if we have a failure, I'm just taking our JSON response and making sure that it actually fails, because fetch doesn't actually fail on its own. And if you're not sure why that is, I have a full video on fetch. I'll link in the cards for you. But then what we want to do is just catch that error, and we'll just say console.error re.error, because we're just going to send down an error from our server if there is an error. Right here, this is all the client-side code you need. Really, all you want to do is make a request to your server at the URL you create, and then you just send along the ID and the quantity of all the different items you want to buy. And the rest of this is just making sure we redirect the user if this is a successful request. That's pretty straightforward code for the most part. And then when we click checkout, if we make sure we save this and refresh here, you can see right now we're making that post request, but we're getting a 404, essentially saying, hey, it can't find what it's looking for. So the next thing we need to do is obviously set that up on our server. So inside of our server, we can just really simply come in here and say app.post. And this is going to be for our post request to /create checkout session. And this is going to take in a request and a response. And just to make sure this is working, let's just come in here with our response. We're going to send down some JSON. This JSON is just going to have a URL that says hi. So now what should happen is it should redirect us to this URL hi, but obviously we don't want to do that. So I'm just going to comment this code out here. I'm just going to say console.log URL. So now we're going to just refresh here, click checkout. You can see it's still saying we have a 404. Just make sure we save our server. And now when we click checkout, you see it logs out hi. So we're properly accessing our server at this post request, and we're sending down this information with the URL. The next step is to obviously integrate Stripe and create this URL ourselves. Now, the easiest way for us to do this is to use an async await function. So we're just going to make this an asynchronous function. If you're unfamiliar with async await, I have a full video on it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But essentially inside of here, we're just going to set up a simple try catch. We're going to catch our error. And if we have an error, we're just going to res down a send status. So we're going to say our status is going to be 500 because we had an error. And we're going to send down some JSON that says our error is our e.message. So this right here is just catching any errors that we have. And then inside of our try is where all of our actual code is going to go. And in order to get the information from Stripe, what we can do is we can call Stripe dot, we want to call .checkout .sessions.create. This is a function that takes in an object with a bunch of different properties, and then it's going to return to us a session as long as we make sure that we await the call of this function, because this is an asynchronous function here. And this session has a URL. We can just say here session.url, and it's going to return to us the URL from our session. But obviously, we actually need to put information into this checkout session when we create it. And the information we most likely are going to need are going to be the information for all the different items that we're purchasing and how the user can purchase and so on. The first thing that you want to put inside of here is going to be the type of payment that you accept. This is going to be payment underscore method underscore types. One thing interesting with Stripe is pretty much everything is going to be with underscores, so just make sure you're using underscores instead of camel case. And this is an array of all the different types of payment you accept. In our case, we're just only going to accept credit card. You could also do like bank transfers and stuff in here if you wanted, but for 99% of use cases, credit cards are the only thing you really care about accepting. The next thing that we're going to need to put inside of here is the mode that this is going to be. So if you want to do a one-time payment, you would just come in here and put payment. But if you wanted to do something like a subscription, you would put subscription inside of here. This video is going to be focused entirely on one-time payments. So for our use case, we're just going to put the word payment for the mode that we're going to be in. And then finally, we're going to have a success URL. Remember, this is going to be underscore URL. And then we're going to have a cancel URL as well. This is just going to be where do we send the user on success and where do we send them on failure. So on success, what we're going to do is we're going to send them to our server. So we're going to say server URL, and this is coming from process.env.server URL. And we're just going to say /success.html. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for our cancel, except for this is going to be cancel.html. You can make these whatever you want. You can send them back to the shopping cart page if you want. It really doesn't matter. I'm just going to show you the example of these two different pages to show you how it works. And now speaking of, we have this process env.server URL, and this is something that we're going to populate from our environment variable, because normally we could just come in here and say, you know what, HTTP localhost 3000, and that's going to work in development, but this is not going to work in production because obviously we're not running from localhost. So by using an environment variable like this, we're able to change this in production and in development. So let's actually just come in here inside of our server. We're going to create a .env file. And inside of here, we're going to have our server URL, which is going to be equal to HTTP localhost 3000. And that's going to be for when we're doing this local development. There we go. And now what we can do is actually finalize the items that we're going to be sending along for our transfer. So if we go to our server here, so far we have our payment method and the mode, as well as the success and cancel URL. The last thing that's left is going to be the different line items. And the line items is going to be an array of items that we're sending down that we want to purchase. And this needs to include information such as the name of the item, the price of the item, and so on. So in order to get this information, we sent this information up with our request. If we go in here, you can see we sent up an array of items that contain an ID and a quantity. So what we can do is we can just come from our request. We can say request.body.items. That's going to be this items object we sent right here. Since we called it items inside of our body, we call it items right here. We just want to map through each one of our items. And what we want to do is we want to return a new item that's formatted in the way Stripe expects the item to be formatted. So the first thing I want to do is just get the store item, which is just going to be equal to store items.get. We're going to pass in our item.id. That's because up here, we have an ID of 1, for example, here, an ID of 2 here. And this is going to be the information coming from our map. So if we say store items.get for 1, we're going to get this item. Store items get for 2 is going to get us the second item down here. Once we have that, then what we can do is return an object that is going to be in the correct format for Stripe. So the main things that you care about are going to be the price data portion. This contains all the information for pricing. And then we also have a quantity portion as well. So we can say quantity right here. And we know that comes from item.quantity because we have our item right here. Now inside of our price data, we want to specify the currency of the item, which in our case is USD. But if you're accepting, maybe currency in Canadian or something, you would change this to the currency you are accepting. Also, we're going to need to have product data. This is going to be the name of our product. So we can say name is just going to be store item.name. And then finally, the most important section is going to be the price, which is called the unit amount. And with Stripe, it's really important that you always put along the price in cents. That's why up here we stored all of our price in cents. So if you wanted to have a $100 item, you would need to store it as 10,000 pennies. Now for the unit amount, we can just come in here, say store item.price in cents. And that right there is all the information we need to pass along to Stripe to actually create this payment. So if we save this and we make sure our script is saved and just refresh everything, if we click checkout, you'll notice, of course, we're getting an error. And that's because you did not provide an API key. You need to provide an API key and so on. And that's because if we go over to our server again, up here, when we created Stripe, we use this process.env Stripe private key. You'll notice in our env variable, we don't have a Stripe private key. So in order to use a Stripe private key, we need to go and create a Stripe account, which I've already done. So I'll just create this up here. And as you can see, there's a section called developers. And inside of there, there's a section called API keys. And as you can see, you have a public and a private API key. Since we're on the server, we need to use the private API key. And the important note is you need to make sure you're viewing test data. As you can see, there's this toggle on the left-hand side that says viewing test data. Make sure you're using the test key for when you're testing and the actual real key when you push to production. So we can just click reveal test key and we can click it to copy it and we're going to paste it in here. And it's important to make sure you never share this and never accidentally commit this to GitHub. That's why almost always what you're going to want to do is you want to create a .git ignore. And in that .git ignore, you're going to want to make sure you put that .env file so you don't accidentally commit that file to your GitHub repository. Otherwise, everyone's going to have access to your secret key and can start charging things and accepting payments through your Stripe account, which is very, very bad. Now with that done, we should, if we be able to refresh everything and we bring our console back up so we can see it, click checkout. And of course, we're getting an error. We just need to restart our server. When we change our environment variables, you need to make sure you restart your server. Make sure we cd into the correct folder, which in our case is just called server. And we're going to say npm run dev start. And we only have to do this because we changed our environment variables. Now though, if we refresh everything, click checkout, you'll notice that we're getting a URL being returned to us. And if we navigate to that URL, we can actually make our payments. So inside of our script here, let's just uncomment that code back out so it automatically redirects us and refresh our page, click checkout. And you'll notice that we're getting redirected to that checkout page. If I just expand this a little bit, and I just real quick move my camera out of the way, you can see that we have Learn React Today, $300, $100 each, and we have a $200 copy of Learn CSS Today for $500 total. And we can enter in our information. So we can enter in any email we want. And then in order to test successful payments, use the card number 42 repeating. So just a bunch of 42s all the way along. This will give you a successful payment to test. Same with our month, year here. Anything that's in the future, in our case 424 is in the future, any CVC, any name on the card, and any zip code is going to work. And when you click pay, that is going to be a successful payment. So it's going to process the payment, we have a check mark, and you can see it redirected us to that success page, which is what we wanted. Now if we just go back real quick to that localhost 3000 without success, we can see how cancel works. So if we click on checkout, you can see everything's working just fine. If we click back, it should bring us to the cancel page, and you can see it does. Now that's going to be Stripe entirely working for you if your server and client are on the same URL, but if they're on different URLs, this isn't going to work. So to test that, let's create a brand new folder called client. And inside of here, we're going to move all the code that's in our public folder. So this is going to be simulating our client and server being on different URLs. Then inside of our server.js, we can get rid of this public folder because we don't actually have any public code. And we can save. And pretty much the entire rest of our server is not going to change too much for this example. In our script.js though, we're going to need to make sure we have a direct path to this, which is going to be http://localhost 3000. And that's because this is the URL of our server, and our client and server are on different URLs. To simulate that, I'm going to be using live server. So if I just right click on my index.html, open with live server, you can see we're at localhost 5500, which is going to be the live server version. So we have two different URLs, one on port 5500 and one on port 3000. So these applications can no longer talk to each other as they used to be able to. And you'll see if we inspect our page, look at the console here real quick, and I just click checkout, you're going to notice it's saying, hey, I can't get this information because I'm being blocked by CORS. Now, CORS is a pretty complex topic that I don't have time to go over too deeply in this video, but I do have a full video on it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But essentially, we need to be able to get around CORS, and the easiest way to do that inside of Node.js and Express is inside of our server to install a library called CORS. So we're just going to cd into our server folder. We're going to npm I the library called CORS, C-O-R-S. And then we're just going to say const CORS is equal to requiring that CORS library. And then we just want to say app.use, and we want to use that CORS library. And then inside of here, we can pass essentially an origin, and this is going to be where we accept things to come from. So in our case, we can just say, you know what, we're going to accept all requests from localhost 5500. And that's the only place we're going to accept requests from. Now, when I click on checkout, you're going to see that it should successfully work. But of course it didn't. Let's inspect and go to our console and see what's happening. Just make sure we click checkout. You can see we're still getting that error. The reason for this error is because 127.0.0.1 is considered different than localhost. So if I change this to say localhost 5500 and click checkout, that should work. And as you can see, it does redirect us to the Stripe payment, and we can do all the stuff we need to do here. But the one important thing to note is that inside of our server, we also are redirecting to our server URL on success and cancel, but our server URL is not the right place. We actually need to redirect them to our client URL. Let's change this to be client URL. Inside of here, client URL, and our client is at 5500. Because now if we restart our server, do an npm run dev start, now what happens is when we cancel this request, it's going to bring us back to the correct location. But we can't do that right now. We need to go back. We need to make a new request. So this new request is going to have all the correct parameters. Now when we click cancel, it's going to bring us back to our client. But it's not actually bringing us to the right location, and that's because our client is currently inside the client folder. So we need to also put /client here as well. Let's restart our server one last time. We'll just come in here. We'll say npm run dev start. Make sure that we go back to that index.html, click on checkout. And now we click cancel, it'll bring us to the correct location. And as you can see, it did. Really, the only main differences you need to worry about when doing separate client and server is that you have the correct URL for your client, and on your server, you make sure that you have CORS set up right here. So you're using CORS. And finally, that you're calling the full URL for your fetch. Other than that, everything stays exactly the same, which is one reason working with Stripe is so nice and so easy. And that's all it takes to get the most basic version of Stripe integration set up. If you want to go a little bit more in-depth though and really look at a complex version of integrating Stripe into a shopping cart, I highly recommend checking out my full JavaScript simplified course, because one of the bonus projects in that course deals exactly with the concept of a complicated Stripe integration. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.